The town of Ashcroft, Massachusetts, had always carried an air of quiet dignity. Its streets lined with oak trees that had stood for centuries and houses that bore the marks of generations. Among them was the Whitmore estate, a sprawling Victorian home perched at the edge of town, its windows overlooking the river that cut through the valley. It was here that the story of Jonathan Whitmore and Evelyn Harrow began, a tale that locals would whisper about for decades, one that blurred the line between love, obsession, and horror. Jonathan was the eldest son of a wealthy shipping magnate, raised in privilege and afforded every comfort. He was educated, articulate, and known for his striking appearance, with dark hair that curled neatly against his temples and eyes so sharp they seemed to dissect the soul of anyone he looked upon. Evelyn, on the other hand, was not from money. She was the daughter of a modest candlemaker, her beauty refined not by jewels or silks, but by the quiet confidence she carried and the soft lilt of her voice. She moved through the world with grace, and despite her simple upbringing, she drew people to her effortlessly. Their meeting, as it is told, was the stuff of novels. A chance encounter at a midsummer festival, where Jonathan's gaze fell upon Evelyn as she danced among the lanterns. From that moment on, they were inseparable, bound by a passion that seemed to eclipse everything around them. In the beginning, their love was celebrated, Ashcroft's golden sun and its brightest flower, but soon the whispers began. Jonathan was said to have an intensity about him, a possessive streak that grew with time. Evelyn, once lively and radiant, began to appear more withdrawn, her laughter fading, her eyes often cast downward when Jonathan held her hand too tightly in public. The two spoke often of eternity, of promises that stretched beyond the grave. Jonathan, fascinated with the idea of preserving beauty forever, would spend long evenings in the family library poring over books of anatomy, alchemy, and preservation techniques. He became obsessed with the fragility of life and the inevitability of decay. Evelyn, perhaps swept away by his passion, perhaps too in love to see the danger, echoed his words when they promised never to part, even if death should come. It was in the autumn of 1887 when tragedy struck. Evelyn fell ill with a fever that spread through Ashcroft that season, claiming several lives. Doctors attended to her, but remedies were few, and her condition worsened. Jonathan refused to accept the possibility of losing her. He stayed at her bedside for days, his once immaculate appearance now disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He begged her to fight, and though Evelyn smiled weakly, there was resignation in her gaze. Within a week, she was gone. The town mourned, for Evelyn had been beloved. A funeral was arranged, and mourners gathered at the Whitmore estate, where her body lay in the parlor beneath a veil of white lilies. Jonathan, however, was not seen. He locked himself in the upper rooms of the estate, refusing visitors, refusing food. Rumors spread that he had collapsed from grief. Yet when the day of the burial came, there was an unsettling discovery. Evelyn's coffin was empty. Jonathan claimed that he had arranged for a private interment, that Evelyn's wishes had been honored in secret. Though whispers filled the streets, no one dared confront the Whitmore family directly. Weeks turned into months, and Jonathan emerged again, thinner, paler, but with a strange calm that unsettled those who knew him. He no longer spoke of grief, but of eternity, of promises kept. The estate, once vibrant with guests and music, grew silent, its windows shuttered, the grounds overgrown. Servants reported strange odors wafting from the west wing, where Jonathan spent long hours behind locked doors. Candles burned at all hours, casting shadows against the walls. Delivery boys whispered of packages arriving late at night, wax, chemicals, and instruments whose purpose they did not understand. What no one knew, what no one could imagine, was that Evelyn had never left the Whitmore estate. Jonathan, refusing to surrender her to the earth, had carried her body from the parlor after the mourners departed. He had begun an unholy project, one born of both love and madness, the preservation of his beloved in wax. Using the knowledge he had gleaned from medical texts and his own obsessive experimentation, He worked tirelessly to coat her fragile skin, to seal her beauty in layers that would defy time itself. At first, his attempts were crude, his hands trembling as he labored through the night. He wept as he worked, whispering promises of devotion as he coated her hair, her fingers, her face. Days blurred into weeks, the once lively halls of the Whitmore home echoing only with the sounds of dripping wax, the hiss of boiling water, and Jonathan's murmured prayers. Servants left, unable to endure the atmosphere of dread. Only Jonathan remained, growing thinner, his eyes more fevered, his soul consumed by his task. By winter's end, Jonathan unveiled what he had done. In the flickering candlelight of the west wing, Evelyn sat once more. Preserved in a shell of wax, her face retained the softness of life, her lips frozen in the faint suggestion of a smile. Her hair gleamed, sealed with care, her hands folded gently in her lap. Jonathan dressed her in her finest gown and placed her in a chair by the window, as though she were merely resting, awaiting his return. He spoke to her as if she were alive, dining across from her at the long oak table, reading to her from their favorite books. To him, she had not died. She had only been transformed, made eternal by his devotion. But Ashcroft began to notice. Visitors to the estate reported glimpses of a figure in the window, a woman seated in eerie stillness. Children whispered of seeing her face glowing faintly at night, pale and waxen, watching from behind the glass. The stench that clung to the estate grew stronger, carried by the winter winds, though no one dared investigate. Jonathan, once admired, now became the subject of fearful speculation. They said grief had driven him mad, that he consorted with spirits, that he had bound Evelyn's soul to the earth through some unholy ritual. As spring approached, the Whitmore estate became a place of dread. Yet within its walls, Jonathan continued his vigil, utterly convinced that he had fulfilled their promise of eternity. He believed he had conquered death, that he and Evelyn would never be parted. What he could not see, or would not allow himself to admit, was that his creation, his wax-bound lover, was beginning to change in ways that defied both science and sanity. The wax was no longer enough to contain what lay beneath, and soon, the house of eternal love would become a house of terror. By the first thaw of spring, the estate that had once been Ashcroft's pride was transformed into a monument of unease. The shutters, once painted a brilliant green, now sagged against the windows, warped by dampness. Weeds forced their way through cracks in the flagstones, and the iron gates groaned with rust, yet the true decay lay within. Jonathan Whitmore had become a recluse, bound to the west wing of his home where Evelyn now lived. He called her by name, dressed her in gowns chosen carefully from her wardrobe, and kept her seated by the parlor window, as though she might still wave to the neighbors who had long since stopped passing by. From the street she appeared frozen, like a portrait come to life, a figure trapped in perfect stillness, her wax-slick face catching the light just enough to give the illusion of breath. But perfection is a fragile thing, and Jonathan's creation began to betray him. The wax, applied in layers with obsessive care, had begun to crack. Hairline fractures crept along Evelyn's cheeks, branching outward like veins of frost on glass. Where Jonathan's trembling hands had been less precise, the wax peeled slightly at the edges, exposing the skin beneath, and that skin, though embalmed by his primitive methods, carried with it the unmistakable signs of what lay beyond human intervention. At first, Jonathan dismissed the imperfections. He warmed fresh wax, smoothing it gently over the fractures, speaking softly as though reassuring a frightened child. He dabbed scented oils upon her dress to mask the odor that seeped through the cracks, that sour, earthy smell that clung to his clothes and hair. Yet no matter how carefully he worked, the decay persisted. Beneath the wax, something was happening. Something he could not admit. The servants who had remained until winter's end were long gone. Their stories spread through Ashcroft like wildfire, the sound of Jonathan's voice echoing in the empty halls, the scraping of chairs at midnight when no meals were prepared, the faint laughter that seemed to drift from rooms where no living soul resided. They spoke of Evelyn's figure, how its eyes seemed to follow them when they entered the parlor, how the shadows seemed longer, darker, more oppressive in her presence. Jonathan, blind to their fear, grew more devoted. He began to neglect himself, skipping meals, forgetting to sleep. His once fine clothes hung loose upon him, stained with wax and ash. His hands, burned and blistered from constant exposure to boiling pots, trembled as he adjusted Evelyn's position, brushing her hair, whispering stories from their courtship. In his mind, she was listening, still part of the life they had built together. In his heart, she was proof that love had conquered death. But the townsfolk began to talk of other things, things Jonathan himself did not yet see. Children claimed they saw Evelyn move when the moon was full, her head turning slightly, her hand twitching against her lap. Travelers passing the estate at night reported flickers of movement behind the window, a shadow that shifted when no one else was present. And the smell, always the smell, grew worse with each passing week, carried down the streets by the spring winds. Ashcroft had seen tragedy before, but this was different. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with honor and wealth, had become a curse upon the town. Shopkeepers refused to deliver goods to the estate. Clergymen whispered of sin, of Jonathan's unholy attempt to wrest life from death. Mothers warned their children to stay away, calling the estate the House of Wax. And all the while Jonathan remained inside, tending to his bride of eternity, unaware that the town was slipping away from him, that his once bright name was now steeped in fear. It was late one evening, when candlelight flickered across Evelyn's figure, that Jonathan noticed something he could no longer ignore. Her eyes, those blue eyes he had once loved, had dulled. Beneath the waxy sheen, the glassy brightness was gone, replaced by something clouded, opaque. He leaned closer, his hands trembling, pressing against the wax in an effort to restore her gaze. But as he did, the wax gave way slightly, softening under his touch. It was as though the heat of his hand had awakened something beneath the surface. From that moment, the changes quickened. The wax cracked faster than he could repair it, peeling back in strips that revealed what lay beneath. Gray, sunken flesh that no amount of devotion could restore. Jonathan worked tirelessly, pouring more wax, layering it thickly, praying aloud as though his faith alone could hold her together. Yet the more he worked, the worse she became. Her lips, once carefully molded into a gentle smile, sagged beneath the weight of decay. Her hands stiffened, curling unnaturally, the fingers bending at impossible angles. Jonathan told himself it was temporary, that his devotion would prevail. But in the dead of night, he began to hear things, sounds that froze him in place. A faint creaking from the parlor, as though Evelyn's chair had shifted. The soft patter of wax droplets on the floor, though no candle had dripped. And once, as he lay half asleep at his desk, he swore he heard her whisper, so faint he thought it a dream. By spring's end, Jonathan had withdrawn completely. He boarded the windows, shrouding the estate in darkness, so that Evelyn's face would no longer be subject to the gossiping eyes of Ashcroft. He refused entry to family, to clergy, to anyone who dared knock. Within the suffocating halls it was only Jonathan, his tools, and the waxen figure of his beloved. And though he could not yet admit it, Evelyn was no longer Evelyn. Her beauty, the very thing he had sought to preserve, had twisted into something grotesque. The wax, now layered thick and uneven, gave her face a distorted, unnatural shape, as though she wore a mask that melted in the heat. Her eyes, buried beneath the dull sheen, seemed to stare not with love but with something hollow, accusing. Her hands, once delicate, appeared claw-like, reaching forward as if to grasp at something just beyond her reach. Still, Jonathan persisted. He spoke of promises, of vows unbroken. He reminded her of eternity, of the bond they had sealed with, words whispered under the stars. He told himself she could hear him, that beneath the wax and the decay Evelyn's spirit endured. But Ashcroft was no longer content with whispers. Fear had turned to anger, and the town began to demand answers. What had Jonathan done with Evelyn's body? What horrors were hidden behind the boarded windows of the Whitmore estate? The smell that drifted through the streets had become unbearable, seeping into homes, tainting the air. Something had to be done. And so, as summer approached, a group of townsfolk gathered in secret, lanterns in hand, determined to uncover the truth. What they would find inside the estate would stain Ashcroft's history forever, a truth so grotesque it would be retold for generations. But Jonathan, in his devotion, was prepared to defend Evelyn, his creation, his eternity, at any cost. The night the townsfolk gathered outside the Whitmore estate, Ashcroft felt as though it held its breath. Lanterns flickered in the damp summer air, illuminating the determined faces of men and women who had lived too long under the shadow of Jonathan's obsession. They moved quietly, not with the drunken rowdiness of a mob, but with the grim resolve of those who felt justice, or perhaps mercy, must be delivered. The stench that emanated from the estate had grown intolerable, sour and heavy, clinging to their throats until they gagged. No one could pretend any longer. Whatever secrets Jonathan kept within those boarded halls, they had festered too long in silence. The gates, once polished and gleaming, were now brittle with rust, and when the townsfolk pushed them open, the shriek echoed through the night like a warning. They advanced up the overgrown path, weeds clawing at their boots, their lanterns throwing long shadows across the once grand facade. The windows were sealed with heavy boards, nails driven in, with feverish desperation. It was as though Jonathan sought not only to keep the world out, but to keep something else in. At the heavy oak door, the leader of the group, a farmer named Thomas Hale, raised his lantern high. His hand trembled, though not from fear alone. The smell here was overwhelming, crawling into the lungs and settling like a sickness. He exchanged a look with the others before rapping sharply on the door. No answer. Only the faint creak of the house itself, settling in the night. When their calls went unanswered, they forced their way inside. The door splintered beneath their weight, and the smell that poured forth nearly drove them back. It was not merely decay. It was the smell of something unnatural, something preserved and rotting all at once, an odor that clung to the soul. Covering their mouths with handkerchiefs, they pressed forward into the foyer, their lantern light revealing dust and cobwebs thick enough to suggest the house had long been abandoned. But it was not empty. Everywhere were signs of Jonathan's presence. Papers scattered across the floor, journals filled with fevered handwriting, half-melted candles clinging to the edges of tables, their wax hardened into grotesque drips like frozen tears. The deeper they ventured, the more the air thickened with the scent of wax and rot. One by one, the townsfolk crossed themselves, whispering prayers as though each step drew them closer to damnation. It was in the west wing that they found him. Jonathan sat in a chair, his once proud figure reduced to a gaunt shadow of a man. His clothes hung from his frame, stained with wax and filth, his eyes sunken, ringed with dark hollows. Yet it was not Jonathan himself that froze the intruders in place. It was what sat across from him, Evelyn, or what remained of her. She was seated upright in a high-backed chair, her body encased in layers upon layers of wax, built up over months of obsessive devotion. Her face, once beautiful, was now grotesquely misshapen, her features warped as the wax had melted and been reapplied. One eye seemed larger than the other, bulging beneath the uneven coating, while her lips sagged, pulled downward as though she were locked in an eternal, grotesque grimace. Her hands, encased in thick shells, had twisted into claws that seemed to reach toward the floor. Beneath the wax, gray flesh peeked through cracks, mottled and shriveled, a cruel reminder of the body that time refused to forget. The sight drew gasps, retches, even cries of horror. Several townsfolk turned away, unable to endure it. But Jonathan rose, his eyes fever-bright, his voice hoarse yet filled with conviction. He declared that he had fulfilled his vow, that Evelyn was eternal, that their love had triumphed over the grave. His words fell upon deaf ears. To the intruders, he was no longer a grieving lover. He was a madman who had defied God and nature. Thomas Hale stepped forward, lantern shaking in his hand, demanding Jonathan release her, allow Evelyn to rest. But Jonathan's face twisted with rage, and he clutched the edge of Evelyn's chair as though shielding her from harm. He warned them not to touch her, his voice rising to a scream that echoed through the hollow halls. What happened next remains the subject of legend in Ashcroft, retold with variations over the years. Some say Jonathan lunged at the townsfolk with a knife, desperate to protect his creation. Others claim he begged on his knees, pleading for them to see the beauty in what he had done. But all accounts agree on one thing: the confrontation ended in chaos. A lantern was knocked to the floor, its flame igniting the wax that had pooled thickly along the boards. In an instant, the room erupted in fire. The wax, so painstakingly layered over Evelyn's body, burned like tallow, flames racing up her figure with horrifying speed. The air filled with the sickening smell of burning flesh and smoke, and screams echoed as the townsfolk fled. Jonathan, however, did not follow. He remained by Evelyn's side, clutching her hand even as the fire consumed them both. Witnesses claimed his face was serene in those final moments, his eyes locked on hers as though he truly believed they were ascending together into eternity. The townsfolk burst into the summer night, coughing and sobbing, as the Whitmore estate burned. Behind them, flames rose high into the sky, casting an unholy glow across Ashcroft visible for miles. The heat was unbearable, the fire consuming not only the estate but the centuries of history within its walls. By dawn, nothing remained but charred stone and ash. In the aftermath, Ashcroft was never the same. The Whitmore family line ended that night, their estate reduced to ruins that smoldered for days. The townsfolk, though they had rid themselves of the stench, carried with them a horror that would never be forgotten. They spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen, of Evelyn's grotesque figure, of Jonathan's madness. Some claimed they still smelled burning wax when the wind turned just so. Others swore they saw shadows moving in the ruins at night, as though Jonathan and Evelyn still lingered, bound forever in their promise of eternity. But the story did not end with the fire, for though the estate was gone, the legend of the lovers, who defied death, took root in Ashcroft's soil, growing darker with each retelling. And soon, strange occurrences began to plague the town, events that suggested Jonathan's promise had reached beyond even the grave. In the weeks after the Whitmore estate burned to the ground, Ashcroft seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The stench that had haunted the town was gone, the boarded windows no longer looming over the streets like sightless eyes. Yet relief was short-lived. The memory of that night, the grotesque figure of Evelyn encased in wax, Jonathan's fevered devotion, the flames that consumed them both, settled into the marrow of the town, becoming a shadow that never truly lifted. The ruins of the estate smoldered for days, and when the embers cooled, nothing but charred stone and twisted iron remained. The family crest, once proudly displayed above the front gates, lay cracked and blackened, half buried in ash. The land was left untended, for no one dared reclaim it. Children whispered of shapes moving in the ruins, of ghostly figures glimpsed in the glow of the moon. Some claimed they saw Evelyn seated once more, her waxen face shimmering faintly in the firelight that no longer burned. But the most unsettling stories came not from the ruins but from the town itself. Shopkeepers reported candles melting too, quickly, their wax dripping in unnatural patterns that resembled twisted faces. Families awoke in the night to the sound of chairs scraping across floors, though no one had moved them. More than once townsfolk swore they heard the faint crackle of fire in their homes, accompanied by the unmistakable scent of burning wax, only to find nothing amiss. The church bells tolled without warning on more than one occasion, their deep chimes echoing across Ashcroft at midnight. Parishioners spoke of shadows clinging to the pews during Sunday service, darker than any absence of light. The priest himself confided in hushed tones that he had dreamt of Jonathan standing at the altar, holding Evelyn's hand, their faces melted and fused together by flame. Over time, Ashcroft changed. Families began to move away, driven not only by fear but by the unease that clung to every corner of the town. Those who remained lived under a pall of superstition, careful not to speak Jonathan and Evelyn's names after dark, lest they draw the lover's gaze. The land where the estate once stood was left to the wild, its blackened stones overrun with ivy and moss, a scar upon the landscape. Few dared approach it, and those who did often returned pale and shaken, unable to speak of what they had seen. Yet some stories slipped through. A young boy exploring the ruins on a dare claimed he saw a woman sitting in a chair, her face glistening as though coated in wax. When he blinked, she was gone. But the smell of smoke lingered on his clothes for days. A hunter passing by one autumn evening swore he heard voices, Jonathan's low and pleading, Evelyn's soft and broken, rising from beneath the earth itself. His dog, usually fearless, bolted into the woods and never returned. As decades passed, the legend of Jonathan and Evelyn grew, told and retold until it became woven into the very identity of Ashcroft. Outsiders scoffed at the tales, dismissing them as superstition born from grief and guilt. But those who lived in Ashcroft knew better. They had seen too much, smelled too much, heard too much to deny that something of Jonathan's vow had endured. Some believed Jonathan's obsession had bound Evelyn's soul, trapping her between worlds, neither alive nor at rest. Others insisted that Jonathan himself had become the restless spirit, unable to release his beloved, condemned to wander the ruins in eternal devotion. Whatever the truth, the ruins of the Whitmore estate became a place avoided by all but the bravest, or the most foolish. By the turn of the century, Ashcroft had dwindled. Its once thriving streets grew quiet, shops shuttered, houses abandoned. The story of Jonathan and Evelyn, once whispered in fear, became a cautionary tale told to children. A warning of love turned to obsession, of promises twisted into chains. Yet even as the town faded, the legend endured, passed from one generation to the next. Visitors to the ruins in later years reported strange phenomena. Photographs taken near the site showed pale figures in the background, seated side by side, their outlines distorted as though melting. Hikers described sudden drops in temperature, their breath visible even in summer heat, accompanied by the faint sound of crackling fire, and always the smell of wax, sweet, cloying, suffocating, hung in the air. In time, Ashcroft itself became a ghost town, its streets reclaimed by nature, its buildings collapsing into rot. The ruins of the Whitmore estate stood as its heart, a blackened monument to a love that had defied even death. Travelers who stumbled upon it in later years often left quickly, shaken by what they felt there. Some never left at all. To this day, the story of Jonathan and Evelyn is told in hushed tones among those who dare to remember Ashcroft. Historians frame it as a tale of madness, a study in grief gone unchecked, a reflection of humanity's futile struggle against decay. But those who have stood at the ruins, who have smelled the wax and felt the air grow heavy around them, know it is more than history. It is a haunting. For Jonathan's promise of eternity was not broken in fire. It endures still, a bond that neither death nor time could sever. And if you walk too close to the ruins on a moonlit night, you may see them, two figures seated together, hand in hand, their faces glistening faintly as though forever melting, their love eternal, their eternity cursed. The story of Ashcroft is a reminder of how devotion can twist into obsession, how the desire to preserve beauty can give birth to monstrosity, and how some promises once made linger far beyond the grave. And, so the legend remains, they were lovers who promised eternity, until one preserved the other's body in wax.